I'd like to start by really thanking all of you for being here today. I'm based in Dublin, Ireland, and we're basically operating on a global basis. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking to you about, which is really unwrapping the condition and the context of how fake news came to blossom and what we can do to actually counter these sorts of trends, comes from my own experience of creating those digital stories that are based on evidence, based on scientific facts, on technologically based evidence. So it's really about my journey. It's a story. It's designed to be interactive. So if you have questions, feel free to interrupt. So I can't see the participant list when I'm presenting, but Cliff, if you want to interrupt, be my guest. But essentially, this is based on experience of working with organizations who need to communicate about complicated ideas coming from research, ideas coming from, latest tech, and they need to be communicated in a way that's sufficiently clear and concise and compelling to be able to be shared and to have a higher impact. So a lot of organizations do this for just pure information. Some others do it for educational purposes. And then when it comes to corporate, a lot of the time they do it to basically do marketing based on content, the latest craze. So like a good storyteller, I'm going to start my session today by setting the scene. What kind of context do we evolve in at the moment? And I think the first one, which is an important fact, is we're living in a society where news, information come to us 24 hours a day. We're the always on generation. So that means that, we're constantly bombarded, and the problem is not all stories are created equal. And that means that you really need to start thinking about, what's a reliable story when it comes to information, because that's a very crucial aspect of your ability to be able to filter fake news out. The second trend that we've observed, and it's probably one of the most fundamental shifts we've experienced in the past 100 of years, I say, is the fact that social media platforms have completely taken over the role of spreading the news, the information that comes from all sorts of walks of life. And that's actually a free-for-all at the moment. Any one of you in the audience can tomorrow decide, I'm a publisher, I'm going to go into one of those free platforms and publish my own blog. And that is really good, because it really opens the door to self-expression, freedom of expression from people who normally wouldn't have access to, the standard form of mass distribution. But it also comes with strings attached, is that those platforms do not have the same editorial filter as traditional media used to have. So that's basically created a bit of an imbalance, and today we're paying the price for this. Now, there's another trend, and all of you must have been confronted to this. We have been deluged by fake news. It's an infodemic, as the WHO has called it. And some scientists have actually studied the nature of these fake news. And there was a particular study in March of last year, I think it was in Science magazine, and they looked at how information posted on Twitter traveled, and they looked at the speed at which it traveled, and they found that basically fake news would travel much faster than fact-based information. And another thing that they found is fake news would reach up to 100,000 people, whereas fact-based information would typically be limited to up to 1,000, there or thereabouts. So that's a real problem, because fake news can be a great entertainment, but they could also lead people to believe things that are not good for their own health and their own, their own lives. So the reason why fake news are so good at spreading is typically because they're based on statements that have a high level of certainty. I'm just going to give you an example. I love this example. As you know, most of you consume food that contain sodium chloride. But if you just take that fact, keep it in your mind, and then take another fact, the fact that chlorine is a very poisonous gas. And take a third fact, the fact that sodium explodes when in contact with water. It would be just too easy to infer that if you combine something to do with sodium and something to do with chloride, then potentially this could be a lethal combination. The reality is we all eat salt in our food, so it's only lethal if you eat too much of it. But this kind of inference that comes from, those facts peppered over the internet being combined in a disorderly manner really don't help, having fact-based news spreading wide and far. Now, to counter fake news, there's also scientists themselves have their own, their own ability to express themselves, and very often they express themselves through the proxy of science communicators, such as journalists and people like myself and my colleagues. And the difference between us and perhaps people who are in the business of conveying fake news is we have a particular kind of thesaurus. We use words like could, might, may, and there's a certain level of uncertainty in the kind of discourse and language that we use. And that's really unsettling for a lot of people, because all they want to know is yes or no. They don't want to know if maybe we'll ever get rid of this COVID-19 disease. They just want to know whether the virus is going to be gone in a year or not, or less if possible. And that's really problematic in the way that scientists kind of counter fake news, because they never use a level of certainty in their language that's at the same level as the people who produce fake news. So one way around that level of uncertainty that surrounds the finding of research and innovation is to focus on the people behind the science, the people behind the innovation. And I've given you a few examples here on screen. So you probably recognize Elon Musk, innovator, Stephen Hawking, obviously, who passed away a while back, but also a few women, Rosalind Franklin, who participated in the elucidation of the DNA, and then Emmanuel Charpentier, who is one of the co-discoverer of the gene editing method called CRISPR. And so all these people tend to be portrayed, particularly in the media online, as, first as a person before the coverage tends to dive into the details of the science. And that's on purpose, because that's more reassuring. People can, can compare like for like. They can identify with another human much more than, the lack of certainty around their work. So that's an important trend. Now, we're in the middle of our story. You can take a breath, you can prepare your questions, but this is where the plot thickens a little bit. There is another trend at the moment, is there is a need for greater transparency and accountability that's been expressed particularly by people funding the research on the innovation, but also by the people, the very people who will ultimately benefit from that research. I mean, it started years ago with GMOs, there was a lot of questioning about it. Nowadays, it's more about, obviously, COVID, or about typically climate change. But if scientists are working on these topics, and if there are technological innovation coming out of the pipeline, people need to know, and people need to know how the progress is going and in what direction it's going. And there's a lot of discussion among the scientists as to whether citizens should be informed at a very early stage before even research is being funded. So there's a lot of debate around these sort of issues. Now, there's another trend that we've discovered in the recent time, which is quite heartwarming. Basically, the pandemic has focused the public's interest towards research and the latest progress of research. And before, we would never have imagined that, people would become conversant with the basics of epidemiology. You all know what it means when we say we need to flatten the curve. You all know what R number is, or maybe you don't, but it's been very widely covered in the media as, the factor that determines the level of spread of a disease, of the epidemic. So it's really, we're living interesting times as far as science communication comes to bear, in that no medical or scientific concept is too complicated when people really want to understand. And that's where, professional like science writers, science journalists, editors, and, multimedia producers have a really important role to play. Because scientists themselves, some of them are very good at explaining what they do. Innovators are, some of them just communicate, in a very effective way, but very often they're too busy, they're not trained in that way, and they need a little bit of help from the experts. So this is where we get to the point where we discuss evidence-based content, because that's one of the ways that those stories coming out of research and coming out of technology development can be expressed and communicated effectively. And I wanted to just spend a little bit of time defining what I mean by evidence-based content. First of all, they're typically text, audio, video, infographic, these kind of digital stories that you find online all the time, that you receive in your inbox or in your social media. Things that are easy to share. They are typically created from the best available research evidence. At the moment, there's a lot of concern on what WHO is doing, what various scientists working towards the creation of a vaccine are doing. So the best available evidence really requires doing a bit of background research before you get to the point of finding the right research, or the most relevant research. Another important aspect when people create those stories coming out of research is that they need to find scientists to comment with the right expertise. It's all very well to talk about epidemiology, but if you talk to a biologist, they not only have a vague notion about it, or some notion about it, whereas, epidemiology is a science in itself, and it has a lot of experts. One other thing that we put a lot of emphasis on when we talk about evidence-based content is content that's typically based on an original study. A piece of work that's been published by a science publisher, for instance, a research paper that's typically 10, 20 pages long. And that's the source of the story that we're going to create. And the fourth aspect in that sort of creation of digital story, it's very important that the language being used for those stories is adapted at the level of the audience. You don't communicate in the same way with a 12-year-old that you do with a policymaker. And that's a very important distinction. And that really determines the effectiveness of the message and whether people are going to pay attention. So now, this is the best bit. This is the bit where you come in, all of you listening from the comfort of your home. There is a role for people involved in innovation, in research, in anything associated with this sort of scientific progress or tech progress, in that they need themselves to get involved and contribute to the debate by either creating these kind of digital story themselves, or to contributing their opinion to, journalistic coverage or other type of educational coverage. And I think you cannot underestimate enough the value of having a scientist, someone who is involved in latest technology, telling the story from their own perspective. And that's how I think we will start countering all this fake news, by getting the story from the people who are involved. And I love this picture because this was designed by some doctors in Greece during the beginning of the pandemic, and this is designed to illustrate how you stop a pandemic by doing social distancing. You just put the fire out by just putting a little bit of distance to cut the line of spread of the disease. Now, why does this matter in the end? It matters because there's so many stories out there on the internet, mainly, who are unresolved. And I'm just going to take the example of vaccines, because I think it's always a good example. So there was a study done recently, which was published in Nature, looking at the number of people on Facebook who have an opinion on vaccination. And if you look at the blue dot there at the top, there are Facebook pages that are pro-vaccination, and the red dot at the bottom are Facebook pages that are anti-vaccination. And the green bits in the middle are the undecided. And when you think of it, every polarized angle from this, every blue dot is trying to convince the green dot that blue is the way to go. Every green dot is trying to convince the green dots that red is the way to go. So you can imagine, if you project this diagram in time, as time passes, the red and the blue are going to hopefully make progress in their own way. But if you look at the proximity of the undecided to the anti-vaccines and the proximity of the undecided to the pro-vaccine, there's a fair chance that the anti-vax might win that battle. So this really gives you an idea as to why it's so important that scientists themselves communicate and counter all these sort of misinformation out there. Now, the lessons that we've learned about how to effectively influence target audiences are coming from the science of marketing. And I wanted to take a step back and come back in history and go back to basic. And what happened is there's a mathematician called Claude Shannon who has studied how information travels from a sender to a receiver with some noise in between that that affects the way the signal is being transferred. And one of his conclusions was that for an information, a signal, something to be, a piece of information to be communicated from a sender to a receiver effectively, it needs to be redundant. And when you think of it, look at the written language. If you look at your newspaper, most sentences have redundant words in the sentence to make sure that we reinforce the meaning. By adding little words or paraphrase or other type of verbal or textual construct to make sure that the message ultimately reaches the audience. So that's one of the bases of how people try to influence others nowadays. They use redundancy, and typically what they first do is decide, okay, who's my audience? What am I trying to convey? Is it all about educating people? Is it all about informing them? Is it all about trying to market something? And once they've done that, they start going about devising what message they're going to put together. And from that message, this is where the redundancy comes into the equation. They would produce multiple ways of expressing that message. One in the form of text, one in the form of a webinar, one in the form of a blog post, social media image, you name it, video, podcast. And once those messages in multiple formats are expressed, they can then be distributed through, the various channels for video, audio, and text. And that ultimately brings us to the point where we can get engagement for our audience, from our audience, because some people like to listen to podcasts. Other people on their way to work would read some Q&A interview from some scientists. Other people just only watch video. That's what they do, especially the younger generation. So it's very important to get all these messages in a redundant manner through different formats in order to be effective in the communication. So there's a clear value to the audience in making latest research on innovation compelling, because it helps explain complex ideas and make them clear for the audience. And like we said for COVID, no message, no science is too complicated when people want to understand. So there's no reason not to communicate. Of course, from our experience, I wanted to share this with you, is that if you were to share a text that's highly technical, you have very little impact. If you attach to that text a little story, like a summary or a video, the level of impact goes multiple level higher. For text, it's typically 30% higher. For video, it can be up to 80% higher. That's based on real life experience. So it's very important when you try and communicate about science and try and counter a lot of the fake news out there to really make sure that there are multiple stories. And the most effective way we've learned from our experience is that is to focus on people. So we've done it in various guises. I just wanted to share a few examples of what we've done. We can just tell the story of a researcher by just explaining, how they went about their research. In this case, we've produced like summaries about the physics of champagne, and that was a few years ago. And that was distributed to professional network of science journalists. It got picked up by the New York Times. So there was a high level of impact of that story. There are other cases where just simply letting individual scientists or innovators spread the news by providing them these very short, snappy summaries, explaining what the research is about, has had a very big impact in that those stories travel through social media and they get picked up and they get translated. As you can see, this was a story on Bitcoin, and the scientist was so grateful that we actually told the story of his research in simple ways. And there were multiple websites and multiple countries kind of interacting and engaging with the research. Now, we've done a lot of different formats over the years. I just wanted to show you an example of what can be done. We can focus on a given topic and just have a Q&A. We can also focus on the scientists. Once upon a time, they grew up in a particular environment and that inspired them to do the work that they do today. I love podcasts, so we've had the experience with podcasts. People respond very well to podcasts because nowadays, well, maybe not so much at the moment, but people who used to commute found podcasts being quite a good format. And then, of course, interview also works really, really well online. And we've just done one which I really like. It's about learning during the lockdown, and it's an expert in homeschooling who's really sharing, the wisdom of the latest knowledge in educational research. Definitely worth a listen. So there are other ways as well to engage, particularly when it comes to very heavy material. Take a book, for instance, an academic book. Who wants to read an academic book if it's not in their field of interest? So we've found ways around that by creating book reviews, just to give a lighter version of what the book is about. We do a lot of news stories because a lot of us are journalists by training, so journalism always comes back. And then, of course, pictures. We love pictures because those really share online very, very well. And so this particular type of example that I've provided here is really one single piece of research that's been turned into one single image. And that really gives you an idea about how effectively it is possible to convey the latest progress in research and technology just through very simple digital stories. So the lessons we've learned is that we have been able to take science out of the silo. It's all a matter of using storytelling techniques. It's a matter of multiplying the different kind of formats in text, audio, video, and spreading them through adequate channels. And finally, it's important that These stories are shareable because they bring new audiences to people who traditionally would only communicate within their peer group. So that's one of the ways we found to try and counter a lot of the misinformation out there. It's not the only one, but it's a good start. So if you have any questions, I'd be very happy to take them now. And over to you, Cliff, if you've received questions already.
Terrific. So folks, you have two options. You can just unmute and ask the question via the audio feature, or if you'd like to use the chat feature, we can accept some questions that way. Sabine, actually, I had a question, and it really involves the idea of the false news. What has happened globally? And this, I mean, certainly it's happened in the United States, but it's happened. I've seen it happen all over the world. What has happened in culture that makes it more acceptable today to not be fully truthful than it was, say, 5-10 years ago?
I think it's more the fact that it is more readily available. It's the availability and the decrease in the number of filters. The gatekeepers, the media used to be the gatekeepers. So there's always been rumors. There's always been tabloid press, and there's always been, people talking to each other. So this thing hasn't changed. It's more the fact that it's more widely available at a larger scale, thanks to technology.
Okay.
I have a question. You mentioned that, messages should be redundant and you should repeat them across different platforms. What would you say is the most effective, or are the most effective few platforms to communicate scientific information?
That's a really good question. So there's been some studies about that. There was a Nature study by a journalist called Richard van den Noorden, who actually found that scientists like using Twitter. So you're likely to find quite a bit of stuff on Twitter. But in terms of effectiveness, I believe that it's more the images, the video. They tend to travel further because they're more compelling and entertaining. There's an element of entertainment if you want to be successful in communication.
We have a question from Michelle, which is, what do you make of Twitter in light of the news over the past few days?
Which news? I've been deluged.
Well, I'm assuming that an obvious reference would be to President Trump's use of Twitter. So
yeah, well, it's one of the examples. What do I make of Twitter? Of course, it's very democratic. It gives everyone a voice, even people who already have one, such as your president. It's quite. It's more a teaser, it's not very good for going into the depths. It's very good as a shiny little thing that you flag in front of people's eye, so that possibly you hyperlink them onto something that's a bit more of a substantial discussion. We do spend a lot of time on Twitter. We find it very good when there is a good community of people who have a common interest. It really helps having other people's perspective, but it is potentially very misleading if you only connected to people who are like-minded. A lot of professional journalists, particularly in politics, tend to follow Twitter accounts from their political opponent and from people from different political views, because otherwise they would be stuck in their echo chamber and only look at one of their one perspective on the world. And it's very easy to be blindfolded on Twitter, because you could have just one aspect of the story, of the global story. But I mean, if you want to talk about the disinfectant story and all these things, yes, it's very dangerous because there's no evidence-based communication. It's difficult because you can't distinguish between what's actually factually correct from what isn't.
Another question. I was struck by the fact that reading of video content improves the readership by 80% over print format. Is that because people are more visually oriented and would rather look at pictures and images as opposed to words, or does it make the message simpler, or does it just take less effort to understand what's trying to be communicated?
I think the latter is for sure. I mean, it takes less effort. And this particular data comes from a very specific setup. It's communicating for scientists. So it's really showcasing what scientists have found for other scientists, you know. So it has to be taken with a pinch of salt from that perspective. But I think a lot of it is due to the fact that we're all very visual, and we do respond so much more to this sort of stimulus, and that's really what I've experienced anyway.
Yeah, we have a question from Rajiv. With COVID-19, the medicine the president took, it has become a big issue. How do we know if the medicine worked when one's doctor says yes and many other doctors, that's Dr. Oz on Fox News, yet other reputable doctors say no?
Okay, this is the nature of science. We don't always know the truth. We know so much, and you know, the debate on hydrochloroquine is a very good one, because there were some very small studies showing that this substance would have some effect in preventing COVID-19. And then there was a Lancet study that came out last week that says, well, if you look at the big picture, if you test this on a much bigger scale, we don't think it's actually effective. So that was the scientists doing the study. And they also think it could potentially be dangerous because there's some side effects. So the difficulty here is that scientists themselves are never in agreement with each other in a lot of the time. Now, especially for a very new disease like COVID-19, where there hasn't been enough research, it's very difficult to tell you yes or no. So yes, some of those drugs do work. And the strategies that are currently being put into place to develop a vaccine or some kind of treatment are very, very promising. We don't know which one's going to be first to market, because it's not just about having the good idea. It's not just about having the right drug. It's more about how you implement it, how you test it, how much time it takes to get enough patients through the trials. And even though I know the FDA is very keen to try and fast track and move forward on these cases, you cannot just be going too fast, because then it's humans that become guinea pigs. The first to be vaccinated ultimately might be the ones that are testing the vaccine. So unfortunately, there's no yes or no answer. There is yes, we are going in the right direction, but we don't know how much time it's going to take until we can prove that the particular vaccine actually works.
Now, there's another comment here that says that hydrochloroquine and zinc were given to about 100,000 COVID-19 patients in Turkey based on the chief medical officer's belief that it could be effective. How do we verify that happened? How do we learn from that action?
Well, if this has been tested under a normal condition with 100,000 patients, potentially it could be true that it's effective. But you can only find out when you compare people who get the substance from people who don't. And then you do a comparison. I mean, this is how clinical trials work typically, is that you give people some substance and you have a control group that doesn't receive that substance. It could very well be that some of these substances have a role to play in the way the body's own communication mechanism work when they're affected by this disease. In other words, some substance could block the disease from progressing by intercepting the way the communication within the body happens when it's affected by that disease. And that's how scientists are trying to actually interrupt the disease, by blocking some of these communication pathways.
I have a question from Angela. When you create very small pieces of information, such as graphics and single images, are you trying to get people to go and read the scientific paper, or specific pieces of information that you want to communicate on a standalone basis?
Another good question in the sense that, yes, in our own experience, that's what we're trying to do, because we're always aiming at the wider scientific community. But in some other instances, educational graphic can be used to just stimulate the curiosity of children or students towards a particular field. We don't expect them to read the entire study, but we try to get them interested in areas of current research that is worth looking at. I mean, it's all about increasing the scientific literacy of, you know, of you and me, of the wider population. And that's a long way, there's a long way to go. Because, you know, as far as I'm concerned, there's been a really big sports coverage maintained during a time where there was no championship. Whereas
I just wanted to say something on the hydrochloroxine thing. It seemed like Dr. Oz was pushing it, and there was a study in France, and I've seen articles. Where Turkey has said that it prevents pneumonia, and if you give it early, I can share the article, but they've said that if you give it early, and you mix it with another drug, it can prevent the pneumonia, which leads to the intubation and the ventilation, and which eventually leads to death. So they're saying
I don't dispute what you're saying. I'm just saying that there's only one study with a very small number of patients. It may not be representative of reality.
But the second thing I'm saying is that we don't know. Like, if President Trump says something, the media tends to attack him a lot. So if he says, I've taken this drug for 2 weeks and nothing's happened to me, they tend to make it sound like it's a joke. Well, you know, he's doing it. But I've seen not just Turkey, France, and I can show where the U.S. Doctors Surgeon Association says it has a 90% chance. I can forward the article right here, where it has a 90% chance of working. You know, so it seems like I'm not a pro-Trump guy, but it seems like the media has a left and a right side, and they're fighting. So if one side says something, they just seem to dispute the. It could be accurate, it could be, but they automatically tend to dispute the accuracy, the left versus the right of each other. You know, sorry.
No, it's a good point. One of the characterization of some of the online media is that very often it becomes very polarized very quickly. So because they know their audience want a yes or a no answer, they're trying to take sides. The issue here is, until you've tested it on a big enough number of people, you will not know. It could still be that there is an effect. And the French case is a good one in that there was this professor in the south of France, in Marseille, who stood out of the crowd of the other people in the scientific community to say, well, as far as I'm concerned, this is what I'm going to be giving patient in my hospital. And he actually forced the government to backtrack on the position on giving this particular drug, hydrochloroquine.
Yeah. With the other thing about COVID-19, I'm just talking that in general because it's a big topic. It seems like, obviously, the U.S. has done the worst in terms of number of deaths. Sorry, in terms of total deaths, but if you look at Europe, like countries like Italy, Spain, UK, France, and if you take their number, if you take the number of deaths, and if you multiply that by, you know, if France is at like 30K and they're 1/5 the population of the US, if you do the total deaths by million or whatever, the Europeans are having almost. I'm not attacking them, but the crisis has hit Europe almost double what has hit the U.S.
Yeah, no, but I think it's a very fair point. When you do compare, you need to compare like for like. So you need to do a pro rata of the population to be able to compare countries. And there's been a lot written about Sweden in particular, because Sweden was deliberately not on the same way of locking down the country. They were trusting their citizens to do the right thing. And then there's been a number of studies comparing Sweden with Norway, which is a nearby country where there was compulsory lockdown. And they had to do a prorata of the population to be able to compare effectively. And yes, the United States is a very broad country, a very large country. So of course, we're going to have big numbers of disease, particularly if the social distancing measures and other preventative measures haven't been enacted early enough in the process.
Yeah, I guess my main point is that the virus, the U.S. media has made whatever the case is, whether you're pro-Trump, anti-Trump, but there's a lot of saying that he's caused 100K deaths and this, that. But if you look at the numbers, that's all I'm saying. If you extrapolate UK's numbers to our population, they would be almost 1.5 times the deaths we have right now. So
it's possible. Yeah, you just need to look at the numbers. Yeah.
Yeah, because if their population is 1/5 or 1/6 of the U.S. and they're at almost 30,000 deaths or 25,000 deaths. So if you times that by 6, you get 150. You know what I'm saying? The Europeans.
The UK was particularly late in enacting some of the measures.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm based in Ireland. It's the next country, and
Yeah.
we have a doctor as a Taoiseach, as a prime minister, and surprise, all the measures were taken very early. So it is just a question of individual policy in different countries. You can't generalize.
All right, we're coming up on 15 before the hour. I have one last question. Are there any scientific publications that you'd recommend for the non-scientist?
On the COVID topic, you mean?
Broadly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I must say the WHO website is very well done. A lot of the popular science magazines tend to have had their own coverage, so at least you can get really a good overview of the therapeutic approaches, and they are pitched at the level that's accessible by non-scientists. So personally, I would go for this sort of magazine. I don't want to name one over another, but they're on in all the good online magazine stores.
Well, Sabine, thanks so much for sharing your time and your observations and what you've learned about how to better communicate technical stuff. I'm especially glad that I saw that, in fact, chocolate has been believed to be a treatment for muscle injury. So my cookie fetish, I now have a rationale for all that chocolate I eat before I go to bed at night. At this point, it's 3:45, folks. There are lots of other sessions this afternoon. You can use the virtual networking app Remo to talk to people across the world and other parts of Philadelphia, almost as if you were doing it in person. So with that, again, thank you very much, Sabine, on behalf of Venture Cafe Philadelphia. You have a wonderful evening, and everybody have a great afternoon.